two have been the main news as we got into this new weekly reset of the War Within, which is also the release, the full, I guess, release of the pre-patch, since now the pre-patch event has also gone live. However, what has taken the attention of many of the players have been two happenings in the last few days. Well, the first happening, of course, has been the official, the public release, since it was already out temporarily in its beta version, the full open release of ElvUI. One of the few of the add-ons that survived going from the War Within to Midnight. We have seen the resurgence of a few others, like for example Bartender continuing from the War Within to Midnight, or you had Grid continuing from the War Within to Midnight even later, and another one that was still in waiting for having its first release was ElvUI, which was one of the more expected and waited for of the add-ons. Now, despite the initial disclaimers that ElvUI is still in its, internal, initial first steps kind of build, now obviously, as you see here in this clip, in my first take of styling ElvUI, there is obviously still one main thing about this add-on. Even if you go and try it out, while it can function still like an all-in-one add-on. So if you were using Prat for your chat, you can replace it with ElvUI. If you were using Bartender for your bars, or even unhalted unit frames for your frames, why not Platinator or Plater for your nameplates? Maybe if you're not a healer, maybe if you don't care about styling nearly as much, you can also replace your party frames and your raid frames for ElvUI, and even add-ons like Baganator for your bags. However, there is still nothing really set in stone for your cooldown manager. So regardless pretty much of what you want to style with ElvUI, you will still have to eventually figure something out for basically your WeakAuras spec suite in the middle of your screen package that you used to have. Even when you use an ElvUI profile, you will have to choose either you go raw, you go straight from the Blizzard's own cooldown manager and just use that, or you go for one of the alternatives for the cooldown manager, which at the moment are more or less two of them: Better Cooldown Manager and RQI. So you will still have to eventually plug together two different add-ons to finish up your UI. Now, ElvUI still being modular, you can still pick and choose whatever you want. If you were enjoying, for example, your bars styled with Bartender, you can still disable ElvUI for your action bars and continue to use Bartender. Same goes for your chat, your party, your raid frames, your nameplates, your bag add-ons, etc, etc. But there is not really that option yet for your cooldown manager. You will have to find something else. Now, there has been some kind of, tentative kind of plan, of an idea, of a thought of eventually having something for the cooldown manager from the ElvUI developer Lucky One, but it's still nothing set in stone. It is still, even if it were to be a thing, several weeks away from completion. So that's what you would have to start thinking about, even if you plan to move over to ElvUI. Now, the second point for today is something a bit more tragic, because of course it's gonna tug at our heartstrings of something dear to us that we just lost, which is WeakAuras, because this happened a while ago. A clip of a certain player, Norsken, playing around with something that very similarly resembles WeakAuras. Now, if the name is familiar to you, Norsken was already a proficient and prolific WeakAuras maker back when, WeakAuras still existed. I'm sure quite a few of you will have used eventually some of the War Within's dungeon mega packs for the previous seasons, who has gone on and made a private, personal kind of attempt at remaking WeakAuras. Just by the suite, the menu itself is very reminiscent of WeakAuras already, plus you also have the proof of concept of him playing it around, testing it around on some mobs in combat to see some of the options he was able to pull out. Now this is mostly a PSA. It's sort of just as a reminder for everyone, just in case players get misled and misguided by this piece of news. The fact that you have something similarly named to WeakAuras with a menu that is similarly reminiscent of WeakAuras doesn't mean that the functionalities of WeakAuras are back. None of the things you thought you could use with WeakAuras that are combat related can still be used. You still have all of the limitations, all of the secrets put in place by Blizzard, stopping you from, parsing spell IDs, the abilities, the buttons you would want to take for your WeakAuras. Now, what is true though is that with WeakAuras, still, if it were to be updated and upgraded to work in Midnight, you will still be able to go back using, for example, still some of your many non-combat WeakAuras you have been using for a while, something that now you have to unknowingly go and pick make up multiple different individual add-ons for that. You know, things like your dragon riding UI, things like your profession, crafter and skill and knowledge trackers, things like your rare trackers, your timers for your rares in the zones, etc., would still be able to be translated in an upgraded version of WeakAuras. So even though with this faux pretend version of scuffed version of WeakAuras, these mid auras, these weaker auras match actually all of the combat functionalities, the complex computational work WeakAuras used to make is still completely gone. You won't really be able to do that in Midnight. All of the things you have lost that weren't really, you know, pertinent to combat, to abilities, to spells and buffs and whatnot, would still be able to work. So while it is true, we shouldn't really get excited for the wrong reasons about the possibility of a, you know, kind of rebirth of WeakAuras for Midnight because of the combat magic it used to do, it could still come quite in handy for many of the features many players used WeakAuras for that didn't really have to do with combat. Especially for just for tidiness and cleanliness and ease of use of having everything in one. Because at the moment, it is likely you can still find multiple different individual add-ons that can give you similar, if anything slightly worse, versions of what WeakAuras used to have, but they would have to be split into multiple different add-ons. So it could also work as an ease of use kind of add-on, as a hub containing multiple different features that you would otherwise require multiple add-ons to get the same result. So that is the positive thing, the cool thing, if we get to have sort of a reboot of WeakAuras, even with the knowledge that many of the most important features you used to have with WeakAuras are still blocked and limited by Blizzard, still much of the QOLs, much of the improvements outside of combat, outside of fighting, would still be there and easy to get with WeakAuras. But for now, that's what we have. It's a scuffed version of WeakAuras. Doesn't really have, by the way, any connection to the original authors of WeakAuras, or even if it was made by an Echo player, doesn't actually have any direct, at the very least for now, affiliation with Echo as the guild. It was just tinkered with by Norsken himself. We can also close on a somewhat related note. If players were still hoping for some kind of miracles or sudden turnarounds, Blizzard has announced that basically what we see now is what we will get at release when it comes to our options in our add-on features. What this means is basically everything you can do now is what you will be able to do by the time the expansion releases, and no more, at least until 12.0.5, so some 2+ months after the release of the expansion. This is in relation to the Lua API changes to basically what you can do with your add-ons. They mentioned that yes, they will still have some base UI hotfix and improvements and some obviously class and balance tuning that will come, but as far as changing what the add-ons can do, especially in combat, that's all we're going to get at release, what we have now in Midnight. Because right now in the pre-patch we still have some updates to the UI still missing, but the beta version is the one that is ready for release. So they are mentioning some of the fixes that have just come, that they are working on and they have improved on, like the adding filter auras for things like crowd controls, big defensives, raid player dispellable, and even the revolutionary raiding combat filter for your auras. Presumably this should be meant to finally get rid of every single non-combat, non-immediate kind of buff you want to see in your frames as a healer, for example. So as they mentioned, mostly just HOTS and small duration buffs like Echo or like Atonement. But that's as far as it goes, as long as these add-on changes. So if right now, for example, certain features very much requested are still missing, like can we please start filtering things, can we start putting, you know, buffs and debuffs in different position of our frames, for example, these are not coming. At least at release there is no really any hope anymore for these. Now we also have basically the announcement from Blizzard that if anything is going to come, it will start being worked on in 12.0.5, so the first mini patch of the expansion rather than the release itself. We will see as we get closer to the release of the expansion how will this progress. But for now, that's the state we are on with WeakAuras in this beginning of this week, as well as the release of ElvUI in its first official public build. So for today, On this Wednesday, it is now time to leave each other. We are starting our goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who's been supporting Competitive for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, nice. It's one of those times where you're just inside, cozy, with the background sound of the rain falling. Very, very soothing.